tail. So after they shot it, of course, it was the women that turned it into a teepee and into clothing and into a dinner for the next month or so. These women were amazing. They not only made the teepees, but they erected them, designed them, and put them up. This is one of the dioramas from the Colorado History Museum. If some of you are interested, they're fabulous WPA era 1930s dioramas there of all phases of Denver's past. Here they are putting them up, and they could also take them down in a matter of 20 or 30 minutes if the buffalo were running or the Utes were after them. And yet we've dismissed these Indian women and their technology as somebody we could never learn anything from today. Unless you go out to Denver International Airport and see these teepee-shaped buildings which shed the snow, which shed the hail and the rain, and are one half the price of a conventional flat roof to build, as I understand it. And according to the engineering studies, and Joy Spatz would probably know more about this than I do, this has been ranked a great success despite all the initial doubts about whether DI would work. It gets whiter as it gets older because it bleaches. It has net solar gain for heat and for light, so you save a lot of energy in it. So apparently these Indian women did have some idea of what was best for our climate in the way of structures. The Indians were dispossessed, and so were these little critters. Again, Rotary Club 31 is seeing the only known color aerial photograph of Denver in 1860. This is Larimer Square. You can see Cherry Creek in the upper left-hand corner there, and that's Larimer Square as of 1860 in that wonderful diorama, again at the Colorado History Museum at 1300 Broadway. This is extremely accurate, those dioramas, because they were working from photographs, from accounts, from good records of what was there. It even features the first cats in Denver, the first 3 kitty cats, great ancestors of your cats today. This is the first home of the Rocky Mountain News, built in the middle of Cherry Creek, which, as you can see, is all dried up in the winter of 1859. And editor Byers put it in the middle of the creek to try to reconcile differences between Denver City on one side of the creek and Auraria City on the other, these two squabbling, competing little towns. He said, wouldn't it be better if we got together and promoted both of our towns rather than fighting and bad-mouthing the other settlement? Here is editor William Newton Byers, and many of us were hoping that publication would make it to April 23rd of 1909 and make it to its 150th anniversary. He took it upon himself to promote the town, also to clean it up, to chase out the bummers, and did this tirelessly in the pages of the Rocky Mountain News. He even had a shipping news department in there that I think even the most optimistic Rotarian would have a hard time coming up with this, about boat departures from Denver down the South Platte to Omaha, St. Louis, and New Orleans. And Byers, of course, is trying to get the attention of Easterners and investors and whatnot, wondering what would be the transportation hub of the Rocky Mountain region. They knew St. Louis was it for the Mississippi Valley, and he was hoping to lead them to think that Denver would be it here. Notice that his wife, Libby, is leaning on his shoulder. Did all of you ladies happen to notice that? She happened to call him Wandering Will, and he did wander a bit, and he was always promoting Denver for people. And one divorcee wrote him from Kansas, and he urged her to come out to the Garden of Eden, the promised land. And he explained that when God created this earth, the very last thing he did, can we get into creationalism here? The last thing, I can't do this in the classroom, but anyway, maybe here, when you create the globe, was with his fingers to trace the South Platte River and Cherry Creek to the Garden of Eden, the promised land. This was the place, in case you didn't know, where Adam and Eve were originally. If you read the news, they'll explain that to you. Any questions on this so far? But as I mentioned, he was something wandering, and I mentioned that he wrote to Hattie Sankum urging her to come out, and she came in to thank him, and he was very cordial, and this wound up being something of a little affair. These are easy to get into, but as I understand it, hard to get out of. He later wanted out of the affair, and she came after him with a pearl-handled little derringer, firing away at him. And guess who saved him? Right, his wife. Good old Libby right there, chased her off, forgave him, but at that point he sells the news and had to give up a political career, which probably would have been a U.S. Senator or a governor of Colorado, because he was by far the greatest booster we've ever had, this founding editor of the Rocky Mountain News. Here's his office, and afraid you can't see from the back, but it says, one of the signs up there says the Vigilante Committee. And he was very much interested in getting rid of the bummers, as he called them, the riffraff, the criminal element. Keep in mind there's no courthouse, there's no jail for 700 miles. And there were plenty of bummers here, and Byers takes it upon himself in the news to call them out by name. And say bummer Reich Wooten has 24 hours to get out of town or else. And a lot of these folks would storm into that office and try to take him out for a necktie party, as they called it, to string him up. And that's why you see all the guns on the floor there of this early Rocky Mountain News office, and his great interest in setting up a vigilante organization to clean up the town. If any of you wonder about the antics of Denver's city government, this is a photograph of the first city hall, Apollo Hall. Keep in mind that Denver's government was conceived, born, and raised in a saloon. And it took quite a while for them to actually build a city hall and get out of the bars. The city dads had a few drinks downstairs there. And I have the theater poster there to remind you this was also the first theater in Denver. But on that upstairs hall, which was the theater, they got together to create the People's Government of the City of Denver in the spring of 1859. And any wild guesses as to what the first thing the People's Government of the City of Denver did was? Start a Rotary Club, build a new airport, new convention center, new stadium for the Broncos? No, the very first thing they did was to elect Judge Lynch. I think he was an ancestor of Ed Crabtree, wasn't he? And they put Judge Lynch to work right away, taking care of the boomers, the bummers here. And the judge was actually pretty good about this. They would string him up from a cottonwood tree down along Cherry Creek or the South Platte in the middle of the night, and people would come by in the morning and they'd see a little note tacked to the corpse, which would say, "This man was hung." So everyone would understand what had happened. This man was hung, he loved Indians, he stole horses, whatever the crime was. Here's one of the few daytime hangings by Judge Lynch. This is L.H. Musgrove being hung from the Larimer Street Bridge. I think he was a rustler. And can you see what his last request was? Not for a prayer, not for a letter to his mumsy or his sweetheart, but one last smoke, one last cigar before he was, as the Rocky Mountain News put it, jerked to Jesus. I thought that was fairly charitable. Denver, by the time it was 2, had 35 saloons, and I think just one church, no Rotary Club yet, no library, no museum, no hospital, but plenty of bars, and they offered all kinds of goods and services. This was one of those Madden's Wet Goods, so you wouldn't confuse it with a dry goods store. And Madden's is there behind the bar at 1140 Larimer Street, and I researched this Madden's Wet Goods because he was intriguing. He was in city council until he died, until 1941, a counselor for a lifetime, a typical Irish immigrant, and this was the center for the old Auraria neighborhood, the oldest part of Denver. And anything you wanted, you'd go in and see Councilman Madden about, and he'd buy you a drink, and you could discuss your problems. If your son was in jail, he'd bail him out. If the old man needed a job, he'd find him a job. He went to every baptism, every first communion, every bar mitzvah, every wedding, every funeral. The old-time politician